Hello there everyone, Martin here from Affinity for Commander. Today I have something a little different for you, a 4-player game of Ravnica Cluedo edition. And let me tell you, it was a really fun twist on a regular game of Magic. But before we get into what that entails, if you're planning on making a purchase through any of these websites, then be sure to do so via our affiliate links in the video description. It won't cost you anything extra to do this, but it really helps the channel out a lot. Also, make sure to check out our latest sponsor, tcghome.com. This website makes it easy for you to organise your TCG collections, as well as creating deck lists and purchasing cards via Card Market through it. This will save you a lot of time and effort searching through boxes of cards to find the specific one you're looking for, so why don't you check it out, you've got nothing to lose. But with that out of the way, what do you need to know about MTG Cluedo Edition before watching this game? Well, it plays a lot like a regular game of multiplayer Magic, but with a few little changes to keep things interesting. Firstly, decks are constructed by mixing two 20-card Clue booster packs together to create one 40-card deck, and each player starts with 30 life. Next, each player is given 4 evidence cards to help them solve the mystery, and 2 further evidence cards are revealed to the entire table. For this game, the library and the dining room were these such cards. And finally, a way of gathering information about your opponent's evidence cards has been added to the game in the form of making a suggestion. This can either be done by dealing combat damage to an opponent or by collecting evidence 6 during your end step. Victory can either be achieved by correctly guessing the murderer, murder weapon and location, or by reducing all of your opponent's life totals to 0, just as Richard Garfield intended. So now you know how to play Ravnica Clue Edition. Let's begin! I am playing a Golgari and Simic deck, and keep an opening hand of Psychic Impetus, Skitter Eel, Venomous Hierophant, Simic Guildgate, 2 islands, and a swamp.
Danny is playing a Dimir and Simic deck, keeping a starting hand of Sauroform Hybrid, Dimir Strandcatcher, Mausoleum Turnkey, Ribbons of Night, Discovery and Dispersal, and 2 swamps.
Jack is playing a Dimir and Golgari deck, and keeps a hand consisting of Golgari Signet, Murder, Mausoleum Turnkey, Status and Statue, Dimir Aqueduct, and 2 swamps.
And finally, Phil is playing an Azorius and Boros deck. He starts the game with a hand containing Jeering Homunculus, Cloudkin Seer, Boros Strike Captain, Wojak Bodyguard, Azorius Guildgate, Boros Guildgate, and a Mountain. Phil wins the die roll and starts the game off by playing an Azorius Guildgate. With no further actions, he passes to Jack.
Jack plays a swamp and passes.
Danny also plays a swamp and ends his turn.
In my turn I play Simic Guildgate and with nothing more to do, pass to Phil.
Phil plays Boros Guildgate and passes.
Jack plays a swamp and casts Golgari Signet before ending his turn.
Danny starts his turn by playing a swamp and taps out to cast Discovery. He surveils 2, putting the top 2 cards of his library into his graveyard, and then draws a card before ending his turn.
I play Thriving Isle as my land for turn, choosing green as its secondary colour. Unable to do anything else, I pass to Phil.
Phil begins his turn by playing a mountain, and then casts Cloudkin Seer. He draws a card and passes the turn.
In his turn, Jack casts a Sorcery Speed Whisper Agent, leaving the top card of his library where it is with the Rogue's ETB. Next, Jack plays Dimir Aqueduct, returning a swamp to his hand as he does so, and ends his turn.
Danny plays a forest, which he then used to help cast Sauroform Hybrid. With 1 black mana remaining, he passes to Martin.
I play a swamp and tap all of my lands to cast Psychic Impetus. I enchant Jack's Whisper Agent in this way, and pass the turn.
Phil plays an island and then moves to combat. Here he attacks Martin with his Cloudkin, dealing him 2 damage, and then makes a suggestion. Phil asks Martin if he has information regarding Commander Mustard, the Rope, or the Ballroom, and Martin informs Phil that he is unable to offer any help with these questions.
Sorry, not sorry.
Phil makes a note of this, and proceeds to his second main phase. Here he casts Suppressor Skyguard, and ends his turn.
Jack starts his turn by moving straight to combat, where he attacks Danny with his pumped up rogue. I scry 2, and Danny declares no blocks, taking 5 damage. Jack makes a suggestion, asking Danny what he knows about Headliner Scarlet, the rope, and the ballroom. Danny reveals a piece of information about one of these things to Jack, who hastily scribbles it down, and Danny receives a treasure token as a reward for his cooperation.
Gold for information. Classic.
Jack then moves to his post-combat main phase, where he casts Golgari Guildmage. He then plays Golgari Rot Form, bouncing his remaining swamp to his hand, and passes to Danny.
In his turn, Danny casts Undercover Butler, and then plays Demir Aqueduct. Just like Jack, he returns a swamp to his hand with the land's ETB, and then moves to combat. Here, Danny attacks Martin with his Sauroform hybrid, dealing him 2 damage. Danny asks Martin what he knows about the Study, the Wrench, and Emissary Green, and once again Martin is unable to assist with his opponent's investigations.
It's not my fault they keep asking the wrong questions.
With nothing more to do, Danny passes the turn.
I play an island and then cast Venomous Hierophant. I mill 3 cards when the Gorgon enters the battlefield, and unable to do anything else, I end my turn.
Phil begins his turn by casting Jeering Homunculus, goading Jack's Whisper agent with its ETB.
I guess Danny is getting hit by the rogue again next turn.
Moving to combat, Phil attacks Jack with his Flying Elemental, and unable to block, Jack takes 2 damage. Phil makes a suggestion, this time choosing Mastermind Plum, the Knife, and the Conservatory. Jack is unable to reveal any information to Phil, and Phil passes the turn to him.
Moving straight to combat, Jack attacks Danny with his Whisper Agent, and I scry 2 as he does so. Not wishing to take another 5 damage, Danny blocks the agent with Undercover Butler, and Jack moves to his second main phase. Here he casts Thief of Sanity, and then plays Thriving Moor, naming blue. Happy with his position in the game, Jack passes the turn.
Danny plays a swamp as his land for turn, and taps out to cast Ribbons of Night. He targets Phil's Suppressor Skyguard with the sorcery, and not wanting his knight to die, Phil responds by casting Turn to Mist. He exiles the aforementioned Skyguard in this way, causing Danny's spell to fizzle without any legal targets, and Danny moves to his end step. Here, Suppressor Skyguard re-enters the battlefield, and Danny collects evidence 6 in order to make a suggestion to the table.
That involves exiling 6 mana's values worth of cards from his graveyard for those of you that don't know.
Danny asks the rest of the table if they know anything about the billiard room, the candlestick, or Commander Mustard, and Martin reveals one of these things to him, given that he is next in the turn order. Martin is rewarded with a treasure for his info, and Danny ends his turn.
In my turn, I play an island and then cast Anzu, Swarm's Hunger. Moving to combat, I attack Jack with my Death Touch Gorgon, and he declares no blocks, taking 3 damage. I ask him if he has any information regarding Apothecary White, the Lead Pipe, or the Ballroom. Jack informs me that he does not know anything about any of these subjects, and I make a note of this before passing to Phil.
Phil starts his turn by casting Owl Familiar, drawing and discarding a card as he does so.
Hoot hoot!
Next he plays an island and casts Boros Strike Captain before moving to combat. Here, Phil deals Jack 2 damage with his Skyguard and makes a suggestion to him. He inquires about Commander Mustard, the Candlestick, and the Hall, and Jack provides him with knowledge of one of these items. Phil writes something down, Jack makes a treasure, and Phil passes.
In his turn, Jack plays a swamp which he then uses to help cast Murder. Jack targets my Amzu with his kill spell, and I sacrifice my treasure token in order to cast Slip Out the Back. I put a +1/+1 counter on my insect, who then phases out to avoid being destroyed, and Jack moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with Thief of Sanity, me with Golgari Guildmage, and Phil with Whisper Agent. I scry 2 thanks to my aura, and Phil blocks the agent coming at him with his Homunculus. Unable to block, Danny and I each take 2, and Jack looks at the top 3 cards of Danny's library. He exiles one of these face down, puts the other 2 in Danny's graveyard, and makes a suggestion to Danny. This time, Jack asks about Apothecary White, the Candlestick, and the Billiard Room, to which Danny replies that he has no knowledge on any of these things. Not to be deterred, Jack turns to me with the same line of questioning, and I reveal a piece of information to him in exchange for a treasure.
Not yet finished, Jack moves to his post-combat main phase, where he casts Lonus, Genetics Expert, before ending his turn.
Danny plays Thriving Moor, naming blue, and then casts Hydroid Crassus, where X is 4. He gains 2 life and draws 2 cards, and puts 4 +1/+1 counters on the Jellyfish Hydro Beast, before passing to Martin.
Amzu phases back in during my untap step, and I play Golgari Guildgate as my land for turn. Next I sacrifice my treasure and tap all of my lands to cast Dead Bridge Chant.
That's rather risky when you have a 40 card deck.
I mill 10 cards when the enchantment enters the battlefield, and move to my end step where I collect Evidence 6. Here I exile 6 mana's worth of spells from my graveyard, and Amzu creates me a 1/1 insect with 5 +1/+1 counters on it. Next I make a suggestion about Emissary Green, the Wrench, and the Kitchen, and Phil shows me one of these items from his pile of clues. Phil creates a treasure token for his hard work, and I pass the turn.
Phil begins his turn by moving to combat, when he attacks Jack with his owl.
Hoot hoot.
Right, need to stop that. Jack takes 1 damage, and Phil asks him for information regarding Senator Peacock, the Wrench, and the Kitchen. Jack reveals a piece of information to Phil, making himself a treasure as he does so, and Phil moves to his second main phase. Here he plays Azorius Charms for his land for turn, returning a mount to his hand before ending his turn.
Jack plays a swamp and casts Gorging Vulture. He mills 4 cards with the Vulture's ETB, milling 0 creatures in this way and gaining 0 life as a result.
Such a shame.
Jack puts a +1/+1 counter on Lonus thanks to their Evolve ability, which in turn creates him a clue. And for anyone who's wondering why we aren't using proper tokens, this game doesn't come with any, so be sure to bring your own if you ever play it. Anyway, next Jack moves to combat, where he once again attacks Danny with his Goaded Rogue. I scry 2, and Danny declares no blocks, taking 5 damage. Jack asks Danny for knowledge about Mastermind Plum, the Knife, or the Conservatory, and Danny is unable to comply with this.
The plot thickens.
Everybody at the table makes a note of this, and Jack passes to Danny.
In his turn, Danny casts Thief of Sanity and moves to his end step. Here he collects Evidence 6, suggesting Headliner Scarlet, the Lead Pipe, and the Secret Passage. Martin isn't able to provide any information about any of these, but luckily, Phil is able to step in and tell Danny what he wants to know.
Again, it's not my fault of people asking the wrong questions.
Phil is gifted a treasure for his cooperation, and Danny passes the turn.
In my upkeep, I return an island from my graveyard to my hand of Dead Bridge Chant, creating a 1/1 insect with Amzu's ability. I then play the island as my land for turn, and cast Statue targeting Suppressor Skyguard.
Does Phil have another answer?
No he does not. Moving to combat, I attack Phil with my Insect Shaman and 6/6 Buggy Boy, and Phil responds by flashing in Portal Manipulator. He uses the wizard's ability to force my creatures to attack Jack instead, but I respond to this by flashing in Scuttling Sentinel. I put a +1/+1 counter on Amzu with the Elf's ETB, transforming them into a crab with hexproof in the process. This prevents Phil from targeting them with his Manipulator's ability, meaning that only the insect token is redirected towards Jack. Unable to block my Menacing Shaman, Phil takes 5 damage, and Jack declares no blocks, taking 6.
A decent amount of damage, all things considered.
Next, I make a suggestion to both Phil and Jack, asking for information on Headliner Scarlet, the Rope, and the Secret Passage. Phil shows me one of his evidence cards, making himself a treasure once he does so, and I end my turn.
Phil plays a mountain, and casts Curse of Chains on Amzu.
Rude.
Moving to combat, he attacks Martin with Owl Familiar, dealing him 1 damage, and makes a suggestion. Phil asks Martin about Senator Peacock, the Knife, and the Hall, and Martin once again fails to provide any information.
At this point it just looks like I'm deliberately being unhelpful.
With nothing more to do, Phil passes to Jack, who responds by activating his Golgari Guildmage's ability. He puts a +1/+1 counter on Loris, creating a clue with the Snake Elf's ability, and moves to his turn.
Jack starts his turn by playing a swamp, and then moves to combat. He attacks me with Thief of Sanity, and Phil with Whisper Agent, and I once again scry 2 thanks to Psychic Impetus. No blocks are declared, I take 2, Phil takes 5, and Jack makes a suggestion. He asks about Headliner Scarlet, the Rope, and the Conservatory, and I reveal one of my clues, making a treasure token as I do so.
It's about time you help with this investigation.
We then remember Thief of Sanity's trigger, and Jack exiles the top 3 cards of my library. He keeps one of these cards for himself and puts the other 2 swamps into my graveyard before moving to his second main phase. Here Jack casts the Helium Squirter that he just stole from me, which enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. With the potential to make Lonus fly at any moment, Jack passes the turn.
In his turn, Danny casts Incubation, taking a look at the top 5 cards of his library. He reveals Scuttling Sentinel from among these, puts the Crab Elf into his hand, and then casts Roofstalker White. Moving to combat, Danny attacks Martin with Thief of Sanity, and Phil with Hydroid Krasis. Martin takes 2 damage and Phil takes 4 damage, and Martin exiles the top 3 cards of his library. Danny takes one of these, and then asks Martin and Phil if they have any information on the Billiard Room, the Knife, or Mastermind Plum. Martin reveals a piece of evidence to Danny and makes a treasure, and Danny ends his turn.
I return the Deal Gone Bad in my graveyard to my hand with my chant, creating an insect token with 4+1/+1 counters on it. Next I cast the instant that I just recurred, targeting Jack and his Thief of Sanity with the spell. Jack responds to this by sacrificing a clue, putting a +1/+1 counter on his Thief of Lonus and also drawing a card. He then sacrifices his remaining clue, putting a second counter on the Spectre and drawing once more. Deal Gone Bad then resolves with Jack milling 3 cards, and his 4/4 Thief of Sanity getting -3/-3.
What a shame.
Not to be deterred, I cast Skittering Eel and then move to combat. Here I attack Phil with 3 creatures, and he responds by casting Deploy. Phil creates 2 1/1 Thopters with flying and gains 6 life before using all of his untapped creatures to block. Wishing to add to the destruction, Jack casts Status, giving Cloudkin Seer +1/+1 and Death Touch. Every creature involved in the skirmish is destroyed, and I move to my end step where I collect Evidence 6. I mistakenly create another insect with 5+1/+1 counters on it, forgetting that I'd already created one at the start of my turn, and ask the rest of the table for knowledge concerning Commander Mustard, the Candlestick, and the Ballroom. Phil is unable to provide me with any information, however Jack shows me one of his evidence cards and creates another treasure for doing so. With no further actions, I pass to Phil.
Phil plays an island and casts Lavinia of the 10th.
Protection from red in a game with no other red players.
Lavinia detains all of Jack's, Martin's, and Danny's non-land permanents apart from Jack's Squirter and Martin's perpetually tapped Shaman, and Phil moves to combat, where he attacks Danny with Owl Familiar. Danny takes 1 damage in this way, and Phil makes a suggestion to him about Senator Peacock, the Rope, and the Lounge. Danny reveals some juicy info to Phil, gaining himself a treasure, and Phil passes the turn.
Jack begins his turn by playing a swamp and then casts Amzu, Swarm's Hunger.
This is getting out of hand. Now there's 2 of them.
Moving to combat, Jack attacks Danny with Helium Squirter, dealing him 3 damage, and asks him for info about Headliner Scarlet, the Knife, and the Lounge. Danny reveals a piece of evidence to Jack, creating a treasure, and Jack ends his turn.
Danny plays a forest, which he then used to help cast Ivy Lane Denizen. Unable to attack, he moves to his end step, where he collects Evidence 6 and makes a suggestion. Danny asks the table if they know anything about the Wrench, Apothecary White, and the Kitchen, which Martin, unsurprisingly, does not.
Again, not my fault.
Phil also makes it known that he knows nothing about these topics, leaving Jack to come to the rescue and offer Danny some valuable information. Jack is rewarded for his efforts with the treasure, and Danny passes to Martin.
In my upkeep, I return Passwall Adept to the battlefield from my graveyard and create a 1/1 insect with 2 +1/+1 counters on it as I do so. Next I curse Phil for preventing my big creatures from being able to attack, and with my disapproval noted, I cast Master Biomancer. Moving to my end step, I collect Evidence 6 and make a suggestion of Senator Peacock, the Wrench, and the Ballroom. Phil is unable to provide any evidence on these subjects, however Jack once again jumps in to show off one of his cards to the questioner.
Now there's a man who can be relied on to be helpful.
Jack makes a treasure, and I scribble down some notes before passing the turn.
Phil draws and moves straight to his end step. Jack responds to this by activating his Guild Mage's ability to put a +1/+1 counter on Lonus, and Martin responds to this by casting a Rapid Hybridization. He destroys Jack's Amzu in this way, replacing her with a 3/3 Frog Lizard token, and Golgari Guildmage's ability then resolves, placing a counter on Jack's Snaky Shaman. This creates Jack another clue, and once the stack is empty, Phil collects evidence 6. He inquires about Apothecary White, the knife, and the secret passage. And in a shocking turn of events, nobody's able to reveal any evidence about any of these 3 topics. The entire table frantically takes some notes, and Phil ends his turn.
In his turn, Jack moves straight to combat, and I make Whisper Agent unblockable with Passable Adept's ability. Next, Jack uses Golgari Guildmage's ability to put +1/+1 counter on himself, and sacrifices a clue to put a +1/+1 counter on his Frog Lizard with Lotus's ability. Jack then draws from the sacrificed clue, and uses Helium Squirter's ability to give all of his counter-possessing creatures flying, before sending them all at Phil. I scry 2, and before blocks are declared, Jack sacrifices another clue, putting a +1/+1 counter on Gorging Vulture and drawing another card. Seeing that he has no way of surviving this assault, Phil declares no blocks, ready to accept defeat with open arms. Not wishing for Jack to see all of Phil's evidence when he takes him out of the game, Danny swoops in and casts Snake Form, turning Whisper Agent into a 1/1 snake until the end of the turn.
Now that is a sneaky play.
Danny draws, Phil takes an almost lethal amount of damage, and Jack exiles one of the top 3 cards of Phil's library with Thief of Sanity. A rather unhappy Jack then makes a suggestion, asking Phil for information about Apothecary White, the knife, and the secret passage. Phil shows Jack one of his pieces of evidence, creating a clue as he does so, and Jack decides to try and solve the mystery as to who committed the murder of Guild Mage Body. He writes his answer on a slip of paper before checking if he's correct, only to find that he was not right, and the game continues.
Well, that's one player who can no longer guess.
Unable to do anything else at this time, Jack passes to Danny.
Danny starts his turn by playing a swamp and casts Duskshell Crawler. He used the Crawler's ETB to put a +1/+1 counter on his white, and Ivy Lane Denison's ability to put a +1/+1 counter on herself, and then casts Demir Strandcatcher. Moving to combat, Danny attacks Phil with his Hydra, Martin with Thief of Sanity, and Jack with his white. Wanting revenge on Danny, Jack responds by casting the Integrity that he stole from Phil, giving Phil's Owl Familiar +2/+2 in this way.
So Phil can block and not lose the game? What karma!
However, Danny responds to this by flashing in Scuttling Sentinel, putting a +1/+1 counter on Hydroid Krasis and a +1/+1 counter on Demir Strandcatcher. Damage then occurs with Martin taking 2, Phil taking 5, and Jack taking 3, and Phil reveals all of his evidence to the table when he's knocked out of the game. He possessed info about the secret passage, the knife, Headliner Scarlet, and Emissary Green, and Danny then makes a suggestion about Apothecary White, the lead pipe, and the billiard room. Martin reveals a requested piece of evidence to Danny, creating a treasure as he does so, and Danny attempts to solve the murder. He writes his thoughts down on a piece of paper and checks the answer only to find he has guessed correctly!
Woo! Nice one, Danny.
And for all you budding detectives playing along at home, the killer was in fact Apothecary White with the lead pipe in the study. Let us know if you figured it out in the comments section below.
Well, that is it for another gameplay video. I do hope that you enjoyed seeing this little bit of a twist on our usual content. Let me know in the comments below if you did. As always, I'd like to give a huge thank you to each and every one of our incredible patrons, without whom we'd be unable to continue making content such as this. Thank you so much for your support. Also, don't forget that you can help to support the channel in 4 quick and easy ways: liking this video, subscribing, hitting that bell icon, and leaving us a comment. I read every one. That's it for now though, we'll see you next time. Stay awesome!